Hi, welcome to another session on day 2 of our Global Resilience Summit. And I'm here today with Dr. Bessel. Welcome, Dr. Kolk.
Good to be here.
It's a privilege to be here with you today. Thank you so much and being generous with your time. Really looking forward to this conversation. So I want to let most of our audience is probably very familiar with your work, but I want to reference a little bit of it for those who may not be. So first of all, Dr. Bessel is just really a pioneer in the understanding and treatment of trauma. He has spent his career studying how children and adults adapt to traumatic experiences and has translated emergent findings from neuroscience and attachment research to develop and study a range of treatments to traumatic stress in children and adults. Dr. Kolk was involved in a lot of the early studies into traumatic stress and PTSD, and bringing to bear the current capacities of neuroscience and neuroimaging and so forth to investigate this. His work was very involved in leading to the establishment of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a congressionally mandated initiative that now funds approximately 150 centers specializing in developing effective treatment interventions for children. Dr. Kolk has focused on studying treatments that stabilize physiology, increase executive functioning, and help traumatized individuals to feel fully alert to the present. And this has included studies of treatments like EMDR and also studies of yoga, other body-mind disciplines, and their ability to mitigate the negative impacts of trauma. And his more recent efforts have been involved in the establishment of what was known as the Trauma Center and now the Trauma Research Foundation, and that is very well trained and supported clinical teams specializing in the treatment of children and adults with histories of child maltreatment, and that apply treatment models that are widely taught and implemented nationwide, and been involved with studying the effects of neurofeedback as well as MDMA assisted therapies on behavior, mood, executive functioning, and has published many, many papers and books, and best known for his best-selling book, The Body Keeps the Score. So again, welcome.
Listening to what this guy has done with his life, like, wow.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear our bios. We wonder, wow, I guess I've been around a while, been busy, right? So I'd like to start off with just a question about, for you, this past 12, 13 months has been an incredibly challenging, daunting time for all of us with the pandemic, the lockdowns, all the social and political unrest related to our reckoning with the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, racism, the final stages of the Trump administration. It's just been quite a year. And I'm just wondering how it's been for you, your family, and your community of clinicians that you work with.
Well, I think most of us have done very well, actually. Mm-hmm. Zoom has been a wonderful thing. Most of us continue to have a practice. Of course, my lab didn't run because we couldn't run subjects for a while. But it had very mixed impact. Some people who, if you're in a relationship where you fundamentally love each other, being locked up together isn't so bad. If you're in a relationship where you can barely tolerate each other's presence, it's been hell. Raising kids by yourself in the past year has been very, very difficult. But having a partner with whom you raise a kid can have been unusually pleasurable. And so it's very different for different people. For me, the political situation was more traumatic than the pandemic. Having grown up under the Nazis, seeing America turn into the possibility of a totalitarian country was very, very stressful for me.
Yeah, I would imagine perhaps the Capitol insurrection, probably one of the more painful moments of all that, seeing that.
And whatever led up to it.
Yeah, and everything that led up to it, yeah.
Self-glorification. I mean, that's where my interest in trauma came from Nazi Germany, actually, of people following a very destructive person.
Yeah, I think that's it's obviously one of the major human case studies in historical and intergenerational trauma. I'm privileged to be part of a retreat that happens at Auschwitz every year for the last 24 years now. I've been there 20 times myself, and very transformative experience. We bring people from all over the world to spend a week at the camp just bearing witness to what happened there. So, the overarching inquiry around this summit is, how do we develop the individual, collective, systemic resilience we need to navigate the really daunting challenges facing humanity right now with climate emergency and everything else we're going through. The world's getting ever more complex and seems to be less stable than it's been in the past, perhaps. And but before we kind of get into that and specifically talking about trauma, I'm wondering, how would you define resilience? What does resilience itself mean to you?
Resilience is the capacity to face reality and to act according to the data that you see in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people get traumatized, it overwhelms them and they shut down or they start going into fight flight, and they basically lose their capacity to make thoughtful decisions, and they react more automatically. And we all do that to some degree. And we always, if you push it far enough, you'll go into very old habits. But the more mindful you are, the more of a social support system you are, the better trained you are, the more you know yourself, you can really separate yourself out from the noise or the misery that's happening outside of yourself, the better off you are in a way.
Mm-hmm. So resilience as a capacity then would be a capacity that we can increase or develop further through various kinds of personal work and training and healing work and so forth.
Yeah, and most of all, I think through social issues. Like, we send our kids to schools where they learn how to feel their bodies, where they sing, where they do theater, where they do sports, where they learn to collaborate with other people. And of course, there's a big social divide here. That if you're a privileged person, you get an education where all kind of resiliency traits are being fostered.
Mm-hmm.
And the poorer you are in the US, the poorer the school district you go to, and the fewer and fewer opportunities you have to really build up the very things you need to cope with adversity.
Yeah, and that's showing up in a lot of the social issues we have today, and that are driven by so much injustice and just even the resources people meet from the beginning of their life going forward.
Right. Income inequality, not having a community that raises children, raising children all by yourself under harrowing situations, having a salary that doesn't meet the requirements of your rent. I mean, the social issues are really gigantic. And when we talk with therapists, the important thing is that therapy is only very, very small part of the overall picture of what causes trauma and what can heal trauma. Therapy can only do a very small part of it. But policies and the world we live in is terribly important. Yeah.
So you talked about a capacity to sort of face the challenges of our life and to sort of, I guess, navigate them in a fairly objective, reasonable way based on what we're actually experiencing.
Let me give an example. So during my internship, so I went to medical school, they brought in a little child that was burned all over that child's body. If I would see that today, or if you would see it, you'd probably freak out. But in medical school, you get trained that if that happens, you do that, you do that, you do that, you do that. And rather than getting overwhelmed by your emotions about what is happening to the child and becoming paralyzed and just screaming, okay, I need to get my D2W, and I need to get my this, and I get my that. I need to get my various fluids in and make a pathway. And so you're prepared to do and to act, to respond to it, and not get hijacked by your emotions.
Mm-hmm. So that what the example you were describing, we have we feel maybe armored with more information, and we have a certain perspective and a sense of being able to do something, or we have some resources with which to meet the challenge.
It's not just a perspective; it is knowing that you know what to do at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
Somatic thing.
Yeah.
What your body can do to take care of it. Like if you have a 50-week black belt in karate and somebody walks down the street and starts
Hmm.
bothering you, you go like, you can continue to bother me, but before too long, I'll chop you up, And so you know what to do. uh,
Got
and
it.
as long as you know what to do, or as long as you know that there are people who have your back, who will
Right.
take care of it. And so the social environment is terribly important that if I feel overwhelmed, I know that I can call you and you'll help me to do it.
Yeah, this intersection of individual capacity and our social structures, support structures, it's always at play and very important. And so, like what you were describing sounded a lot like when we talk about psychological well-being or eudaimic well-being. Part of that is just a sense of self-efficacy, self-confidence. Just we have confidence felt in our body.
For me, uh, those are nice words, but they're a little abstract for my taste.
Mm-hmm. But it's a felt sense in the body that I can handle this, that I can handle my life.
But actually cultivating it. You cannot just sit in the chair yakking about stuff. You actually need to do it. Huh?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great. So you were talking about, so we can get pushed into a reactive mode. Now, one could say that until we start really working with some kind of awareness techniques, we all operate in a somewhat conditioned mechanical mode. And then there's when we get really reactive. So is there a distinction between training ourselves so we can actually even move beyond that kind of more conditioned mechanical operation to really be in a more aware, responsive state that will make it less likely that we're going to get triggered into that reactive, unresourced place?
Well, of course, that's how you raise kids, huh?
Mm-hmm.
The babies are completely instinctual and reactive and have regular meltdowns and temper tantrums and catastrophic events. But because they have parents, hopefully, who are more wise and more in control than you are, your parents will take care of that for you. Huh? And
Mm-hmm.
the task of raising a child is to transfer that capacity to keep observing and finding a solution to your child. That's when your child goes off to college. They are more or less equipped to be able to read the environment and see what the best response would be.
Mm-hmm.
But if nobody's there for you growing up, or you got beaten up or molested, then that capacity to stay mindfully observant and see what I can do gets severely hampered.
Yeah, and it seems like many people, maybe all of us to a certain degree, but many people much more severely, because of whatever gaps there might have been in that early childhood experience. There's some places we get triggered toward. It's almost like the bottom falls out. It's kind of a black hole. It's just a trap door falls out from underneath our feet, and it's just we go just right into a completely unresourced place. So, how do you understand that in terms of your understanding of trauma, and then how we work with that?
Well, that's what trauma is. The trauma is something happens to you that that puts you into this state of meltdown, helplessness, and it becomes a trauma if that event continues to live on inside of you,
Mm-hmm.
and something can trigger it, and you start behaving and feeling again as if you're in that catastrophic situation.
Mm-hmm. And so, how do we work with that? What are some of the basic? I mean, I know there's lots of types of treatment, but there probably is some universal principles in how we begin to heal that, how we begin to increase our resilience, our ability to handle our lives again.
I think very fundamental is uh, really getting in touch with your body and reading its signals, so that if you start feeling upset, freaked out, worried, etc., that you can actually have an internal dialogue with, oh, this is what's stirring up for me, what's happening, how can I keep myself down, and to really make some decisions about what's going on with you. And so a very critical issue is getting into a state of self-knowledge and self-compassion, where you know that organism that you inhabit. Huh? And then you can train your physiology to calm yourself down. Uh, Non-Western techniques, Tai Chi, Qigong, martial arts, yoga, tango dancing, all kind of ways in which you can actually train your body to be very carefully geared to respond adequately to various situations. And then you can go beyond that, and you can go deal with particularly traumatic memories and do things like EMDR or brain spotting. You can quiet down those old memories. You can deal with different parts of yourself and understand how you're functioning inside of yourself. Neurofeedback is very helpful to sort of rewire the alarm systems in your brain. And most recently, psychedelic agents can be extraordinarily helpful to sort of help you to rearrange your internal system.
Well, I'd like to ask questions about both those things in just a moment. I'm curious. We can think of, I think, resilience or being triggered into a traumatic memory and then be in a state of non-resilience, right? Or we can maybe re-access a state of resilience. But in terms of, kind of the default situation or the trait, is trauma something that we can actually see through imaging of any kind, or is a resilient brain or resilient nervous something we can actually see or measure through any kind of neuroimaging, or is it so complex that it doesn't really show up that way?
Well, what's been fascinating to me is that I grew up in psychiatry, was just beginning to discover chemicals. Mm-hmm. And so every interview was about chemicals. And then we learned how to take pictures of the brain, great new technology, and now everybody talks in terms of the brain.
Right.
And then we learned to measure DNA, and now we measure things through epigenetics. Brain is very nice, epigenetics is very nice. I did the first neuroimaging study of trauma, but you can see it. If somebody blows up or somebody shuts down, you don't need a brain scan to see it happening. Mm-hmm. So it's right in front of you. You see somebody who is otherwise perfectly reasonable suddenly becoming frightened, uptight, etc., etc. So we see people's physiology play themselves out right in front of us in terms of the tone of voice and the way they hold their bodies. And then indeed, when you put people in the scanner, which is a little complicated because when you put people in the scanner, you basically put a head in a vice in a very scary environment. So you already put them in a very fear-driven environment. And indeed, you see what changes in the brain. And in fact, we have learned more about how the brain responds to trauma than anything else about the brain. And that's the great advances in neuroscience are about how the brain responds to trauma. Mm-hmm. And you see all these pathways are different, and the insula is messed up, and that's the part of your mind that connects with your body, and your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is changed, so you don't get a sense of time, and that even I feel right now terribly, 5 minutes from now I can feel better, so you lose that time perspective, you lose your perspective of I would like to do this, but I shouldn't. So you learn to not inhibit yourself anymore. And your filtering system in your brain changes so that stuff that ordinarily would seem irrelevant doesn't get filtered out as being irrelevant. So your brain takes things in that it should actually be pushing away. So multiple things in the brain get messed up by trauma.
Yeah, fascinating. I'm wondering, in terms of thinking about healing from trauma at whatever level that we have or anyone has, and maybe this is saying the same thing from different perspectives, I don't know. But at what level is it kind of, healing, whatever, let's say even think physiologically, there's tangled pathways and disconnected circuitry, and we're kind of healing that or something, or that we're actually re-expanding our tolerance to be able to tolerate greater challenges without being triggered. So is there any difference between expanding tolerance and healing? Are they the same process?
I don't hear the difference.
Mm-hmm.
A kid will start screaming when it's hungry or wet, and when you feel like going to the bathroom, you go, I have to go to the bathroom. And it doesn't cause a catastrophe anymore. So things get rewired, things get redone.
Yeah. I know in my own personal experience, certainly young, I definitely had a black hole that I could fall into, and I had a big hole in the gut, which caused me to go down some pretty twisted pathways for a while with drugs and the rest of it, and trying to fill up that hole in my gut. And there were experiences that would just drop me into what felt like a black hole. Right. And somehow that's healed over my life. I mean, I've been doing a lot of body, mind, somatic work for a long time, but I've been through I had some really significant losses even in the last year, and that trapdoor doesn't seem to be there anymore significantly. And so would you say that's just an accumulation of kind of that embodiment and mindfulness and
Well, I think that's a real tribute to the human capacity to continue to change.
mm-hmm,
And I think it's very important for you to say that, in my book, I sort of intimated, I say, I've tried each one of these methods on myself also, as I know what they're like. um, and indeed, what you discover is that people can get healed and that you have inborn self-regulatory mechanisms uh, activated through breathing and touch and movement that can actually rewire these systems.
mm-hmm,
And I think the task of psychology is to discover what the best methods are at this point. And of course, you had a question earlier, how do people around the world deal with this? And of course, people have always dealt with trauma around the world because we are a traumatized and traumatizing species. And so it's very interesting for me to go to Southeast Asia and Africa and see how people there deal with their trauma. And it's actually quite different from the Western world.
mm-hmm,
A lot of moving, dancing, and people getting physically in sync with each other.
mm-hmm.
Seems to be the oldest and best established way for people to regain capacity to take care of themselves.
And traditionally, a lot of these healing practices have been embedded in our religious traditions and shamanic traditions, spiritual traditions of movement and dance, ecstatic dance, singing, vocalization, and so forth.
But
Mm-hmm.
less and less so in our mainstream culture.
Mm-hmm.
When I grew up, um, I sang all the time in various conditions. And today, how often do people sing together with friends?
Mm-hmm. Right.
How often do people make music with friends? So some of these deeply soothing things have become esoteric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned neurofeedback before as one treatment modality that you've worked with, and my understanding about that is we're hooked up to a machine that measures brain waves, and we get some visual feedback, like in biofeedback, where maybe we're just hooked up to a heart monitor, and neurofeedback, it's measuring brainwave, and we get that feedback loop, and it allows us to do some work with simple biofeedback. You can adjust your heart rate just by learning to do that. So I've been working and developing a model I call neurosomatic mindfulness for quite a long time now. And I've been taking a very embodied approach to meditation and mindfulness practice for really over 30 years, but deepening all the time. And I've gotten the sense that we can develop a kind of internal neurobiofeedback loop where we can actually feel the changes in our overall physiology and neurophysiology through different kind of meditative efforts, strategies, practices, methods, or so forth. And by really awakening a much deeper or more enhanced level of kind of neuroceptive awareness or interoceptive awareness, and that there is a kind of coherence there, resonance that's part of our being at a deeper level that we can tap into, and we can actually learn, maybe even feel when we're making that shift from the kind of noisy default mode network in the brain to the more attention stabilizing task positive network, that we can internally learn to feel these experiences to develop a level of self-agency and self-regulation that can be quite profound, I think. I'm curious about your thoughts about that and healing.
You're absolutely right. We are feedback dependent organisms. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
And if I talk to you and you frown at me and wiggle your eyes, I go, oh, I better change the subject. And if you smile at me and go like, wow, I go a little bit deeper into what I'm talking about. So we are feedback machines, and we're completely social creatures, which is a dimension that is oftentimes left out of our field, that we all are interactive with each other and depend on our interactions. So I think the question is, what's the most effective way of rewiring the brain? And certainly meditation is shown to be able to do that, and it can do it very powerfully. And like Mathieu Ricard, last time I counted, he had done 38,000 hours of mindfulness meditation. And when you meet him, go like, wow, this guy is really beautifully regulated. I called it the non-American way. Like how many people are going to meditate for 38,000 hours before they get peace of mind. so, uh, so we want to speed it up a little bit, and uh, and so uh, some of my patients have described neurofeedback as Buddhist meditation on steroids.
Mm-hmm.
To some degree, there's many ways of going there, and be always distrustful of anybody who says to you, "I have found the answer." Those are people should be immediately cast aside because they have lost their curiosity, and say, "I have found a way that might be very helpful." And maybe tomorrow somebody else will find another way that's very helpful. But the core issue is what is available to you in your community that can help you to come to the space where you don't get hijacks by things going around you all the time, and you really become the center of your stable universe. And there's many ways of getting there, but very much the way of getting there, almost everybody I know who gets there via some sort of meditative, mindfulness, interoceptive, deep visiting oneself practice.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to be very important, whatever kind of treatment modality, whether it's self-help or whether it's therapeutic treatment, the more embodied and more it engages the body seems to be important.
Yeah, our culture very much disregards the body. It's something to be prettified and kept slim and all sort of stuff. But we don't really appreciate ourselves that I am my body. My little brain is sitting on top of my body to make sure that my body is okay. And Zero said, "Oh, the body gets in the way of all that." No, we are organisms. Yeah.
It would seem that a lot of trauma treatment modalities have to do with, in some way, maybe in a self-titrated or safe way, kind of leaning into what's comfortable, coming back, leaning in, leaning out to increase that tolerance or something. But it seems to be able to do that. We also need that safe place. We need some kind of home base of resilience from which we can do that work.
Right.
And I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's indeed, you need to find a place of safety. And for some people, their place of safety may start off as being somebody else. Because they themselves feel so upset that you need to go see somebody who exudes a sense of calm and competence, who lends you that sense of calm and competence. And then from that, don't plunge into your trauma. Just learn to just sit in a chair. Learn to walk down the street. Learn to cook a meal. And start off with simple things. Don't open up that gang rape because that's sure going to mess you up. So go with how long can they be present and fully alert to what's happening right now? And then the trick is to expand it very slowly. And the word that you didn't use, but we're hinting at, is the word that I learned from Peter Levine, and it's the word pendulation. You go into a little bit about the pain of the past, and you come back to a safe place. You do a little bit more, but in the long range, it's important to visit it and to know and tolerate what has happened to you actually has happened to you. And for many people, that is a very hard thing to face. Like coming to the conclusion that my parents did not love me. It's a terribly painful decision to come to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or any number of things. Or my somebody wanted me dead. Or these are very, very painful things to come to terms with. And it needs to be done very gently and very, very compassionately. Yeah.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the social. I mean, you have been speaking of this, but we have whatever capacities we have, and we can increase those through therapeutic work and our own self-training. And then there's the importance of we're social animals, so our social networks, our support systems. And under this pandemic, where we've all been experiencing a lot of threat, any one of us could have got the disease, no matter how careful we were, probably. And I've had visions of, am I going to end my life on a ventilator in a hospital? No contact with my loved ones, right? It's not my ideal scenario for how I'm going to end my life. So we've all been experiencing that. And then one of our greatest resources for resilience is our social networks, and we've been limited to access with those. And so it seems like a double whammy to really put us in a very dysregulated place and not very resilient place. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how we come out of this pandemic and how we kind of maybe even re-engage what can help us all be resilient to tackle these incredible problems we're facing. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's going to get easier. Maybe we'll get beyond the pandemic, but it doesn't seem like the world's going to get less complex or less daunting overnight.
I don't think so. So, for me, Zoom has been wonderful. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
Talking with my various friends and my grandchildren and children is almost as good as meeting each other in person. Particularly if you combine it with food. I belong to a club where people sing to each other. We do theater together. We had a virtual theater performance together. And so I think we're made to interact with people. And so any sort of interaction, cooking together, creating something together, making something together is critical. It's something about reciprocity, about doing something together with other people and making something happen together with other people. And certainly I and the people who I'm close to all have been very active in trying to keep their rhythms with other people going and their sense of reciprocity of we are here for each other. We've done a fair amount of cooking around here and dropping off food at each other's places and then having meals together over Zoom to keep that sort of social connection going, reciprocity and support. And what also has impressed me is how the people who I spend this pandemic with and I are much more explicit about our vulnerability. We tell each other how much we mean to each other. There's no secrets about if you would die. I don't know if I would be able to tolerate it. And so we are very active in celebrating our connections and nurturing our connections, because I think that's really what gives joy to existence. The most important is that reciprocity, taking care of each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's very interesting what you just brought up, which you could express as a vulnerability and willingness to be vulnerable with each other, to be transparent about our vulnerability. And, we can talk about becoming more resilient. And in some ways, you could talk about that in terms of strength and maybe even sometimes mental toughness. I don't love that term, but there's ways we can become weatherproofed and stronger. But it seems like ultimately it's also about vulnerability and fluidity and flexibility, and our strength almost lies in our capacity to be vulnerable with each other.
Yeah, you make it sound as if you sort of make a raincoat waterproof. And for me, it's a very internal thing. It's that our job as adults is to we notice how we become reactive sometimes or shut ourselves down or lose our voice. And then we need to find out how we can cultivate our voice and cultivate our presence for ourselves. And I hope for most adults, that's a personal journey of discovery.
It seems in terms of that vulnerability, well, the relational sphere is one of our greatest sources for resilience, our human connectedness with each other. And you talked about what you've been doing.
Yeah,
and also it can be the place where the traumatization happens. It's where we get hurt, right? Yeah. So it seems that whole relational sphere and our willingness to be vulnerable there, which is how we create deep connection through being willing to be vulnerable, but it's also how we get hurt.
Yep.
And so, when we've been traumatized, we're gonna have less trust and be less adventurous and less trustful at doing that. So how do we relearn that trust so that we can do what we need to do to create the connection? It's almost like a conundrum, right? I don't feel safe enough to create relationships, so I'm not going to get the benefits of relationship.
Right. Well, but we see in our work is that I think if you really feel very vulnerable, you start off with finding a therapist who makes you feel safe. And it's very important to check in with yourself to go like, do I feel safe with this person? Does this person get me? Does this person take an interest in me as opposed to fixing me? is this person curious about me and can help me with my curiosity about myself? Most people try to do it with their partners, but your partner has his or her own needs, and you can trigger each other, and that may or may not be helpful. Of course, at the end, our relationships is what make us grow and make us evolve in some ways. But I've been astounded by, and we're not quite ready to release all the data, that our work with MDMA seems to create a profound alteration in people's trust in the universe, actually. And my team and I are actually quite astounded by that. That we see something brought online that I don't think I've seen anything else be brought online like that.
Yeah, it seems like there's a real resurgence in interest in therapy assisted by, lack of a better term, psychedelic drugs, psychoactive drugs, things like MDMA, psilocybin. And I guess it's almost ready to come online legally. I mean, people are talking about setting up treatment centers and so forth. And one thing I read, I don't know if it was in Pollan's book or not, but one of the reasons they suggest that people have these very unitive or unitary experiences and on these kind of psychoactive substances or even plant medicines is that it kind of takes the default mode network offline, or at least maybe that's oversimplifying it, but allows the brain to be focused in a way that we...
That's interesting, a word that most people don't understand. Typical for medicine, like, I happen to know about the default mode network because I do that sort of work, but I doubt whether most people know what that means. In fact, no, I think it's the wrong explanation.
I'm sorry, what was that?
It's the wrong explanation, actually.
I see. Well, could you maybe in a just simple layman's term, why do you think these substances help us have these therapeutic experiences of trust and oneness and connection?
No, I don't, actually. And I think it's important for us to start off with saying, I don't know. In the same way that EMDR is a wonderful technique, people always have these explanations. It turns out those explanations turn out to be not the case. So sometimes it's good to just look at, wow, this is intriguing. I wonder what's going on here. And to not prematurely jump to explanatory modes.
Yeah. I have a client who, a friend, who works with clients at a clinic down in Mexico using Ibogaine and with addicts, basically heroin addicts, alcoholics. And they've found incredible success, and that it seems like a couple of treatments almost does like some kind of reset on the person's nervous system, such that they're at least for a while free of that compulsive addiction and can reorient their life in some way.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing we're looking for. What can people do to just sort of snap out of it or to get a new piece of input? And I've seen this throughout my career, that sometimes very unexpectedly people do something and they go like, wow, that really reset me. And it seems to occur indeed quite often with Ibogaine, with ayahuasca, with MDMA, that something happens there. And I think we just need to look at it more like, wow, what happened here? But then we tend to become reductionistic and say, oh, it was the serotonin system. Oh, it was the oxytocin. Maybe. Let's find out.
Yeah. That's interesting. I was thinking there's some relationship between that and what is described as metanoia or conversion in the religious experience, where there's just an immediate sea change of some kind in a person's psyche and worldview and understanding of themselves in the world.
It's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. Paul on the road to Damascus, probably the most famous one there in the New Testament of the Bible.
Well, it'd be interesting to ask everybody you know, have you had experiences like that? Huh? And I think many of us have experiences that just go, that reset your mind. And it'd be interesting to think about what they are. And they tend to not be cognitive experience. Oftentimes they have to do with music and ambiance and collectivity and stuff like that.
Yeah, there's a summit coming up that I think sorts out Columbia University and some relation to the Greater Good Science Center at Berkeley. And they're looking at awe and their relation to awe experiences and resilience.
Right.
Yeah, it seems like similar territory.
Yeah, the question, that when you're scared to death, you don't have awe experiences.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, awe causes resilience. But the question is, how do you get into a state where you can feel the awe?
Yeah. Yeah. Really appreciate your time today.
Welcome.
And if you have any just last word, where should we focus coming out of this pandemic? All of us, what's collectively, individually. It seems like we need to get on track with something to move forward.
I think the critical thing is to really be aware of your own experience and how it matches other people's experiences. To really understand that we are all in the same boat in some ways,
mm-hmm.
and that we can make profoundly positive changes by really hearing each other, acknowledging each other, and resonating with each other.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great place to end. So thank you so much, Dr. Van Kolk. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Be well.